Hello, everyone. My name's Alice. Recently, I've experienced the worst nightmare of my life, and it's still with me. I don't know how to stop it. Once during a lesson, I fainted. The school nurse called my parents and even an ambulance. Then there were various medical tests and a lot of unpleasant things. As a result, I was taken to the hospital with an excellent diagnosis: kidney failure. No, some serious things. Just eating according to the schedule, medical services, 2 weeks in the kids' ward and Epi Hospital. By the way, the latter was even cool as I found many new friends. So we were four in the ward, and the days at the hospital were very boring. So the guys and I mostly did nothing but invented and told each other some horror stories about the bloody hand, the ghostly stroller, and other creepy things. And we were particularly fond of the story about creepy nurse. Allegedly, this one once worked as a nurse in the hospital for a very long time, and during World War II, when she saw wounded soldiers there, she went nuts and started doing some crazy things. Like, at night, she came to those who violated the hospital regimen and gave them a lethal injection. Then, when they found out about it, she shouted she would not tolerate any riots in her department. According to the legend, the nurse was shot in the head in the basement of this very hospital. And, of course, her body was left in the basement to be eaten by rats. Since then, she has been wandering around the hospital, taking the lives of those who do not obey the regimen. That's why so many people are dying in our department. It's all about the nurse. I've always laughed at this story. Even the stories about the ghostly wheelchair paralyzing everyone who sits on it were creepier than this one. Because, well, first, our hospital was new. It was built about 10 years ago. I even remember the construction site, even though I was a small kid then. And second, seriously, the ghost nurse lunatic? No, sir. Unfortunately, there were no healthy kids in our department. All of them were very sick, so there was no mysticism in death statistics. Kids just died from their diseases, no matter how much we wanted it to be different. As you can see, I didn't believe in ghosts. Therefore, when I went to the toilet and heard a terrible creaking, I just shrugged my shoulders. After all, this was a hospital. Creaks, screams, and other creepy sounds are normal here, and the creaking was getting closer. It sounded like someone was pushing an empty metal cart forward. Then the creaking was joined by the clink of metal tools and the soft click of heels. I tensed up. If I was in a horror movie, something terrible was going to come out of the corner. But it wasn't these paranormal reasons that scared me at all. I'm in the hallway at night, after lights out. The chance to catch a punishment from a very real live nurse worried me more. First, the medical cart appeared around the corner, covered with a white towel. I held my breath. A nurse followed the cart, clicking her heels. It was an ordinary nurse. She wasn't scary at all. She wore a white coat, a cap, and a mask. I quietly said hello and muttered something about the fact I needed to go to the bathroom, but the nurse didn't even turn her head in my direction. So I quickly ran towards my ward. I don't know why, but at the very last moment, when I was already turning the handle, I looked around and noticed how the nurse entered Ward 4. In the morning, the doctors were running along the corridor as someone was screaming. A woman was crying in the hall. No one told us anything, but we found out for ourselves that an emergency happened in Ward 4 at night. One of the guys' heart stopped. The news was sad. We knew this guy. He often escaped from the hospital to the city after lights were out and brought delicious fast food from there, but when the guy started saying that it was the creepy nurse, I just twisted my finger at my temple. Yeah, the guy died, but we're in the hospital, hey, in the serious diseases department. People die here. They don't keep very healthy people here, so you never know what's gonna happen. The next night, I met my new nurse friend again. And again, she passed me by. And again, when the guys and I stayed up late after lights out in the game room, the guys were really scared then. One girl even started praying, "Fear no evil." But I said, I actually saw this nurse often. And hey, a nurse in the hospital is a normal thing, isn't it? But the treasures thought that maybe everything wasn't so simple had already settled in my head. And that's because every time I met this nurse, in the morning, the same thing happened. The doctors were running along the corridor. Someone was crying, and then we saw a trolley covered with a white sheet coming out of the ward. Coincidence? Probably. But when people scream from every corner of the hospital and your friends keep talking about the anger of the creepy nurse, anyone would start to think some creepy thoughts in the head. That's why when someone touched my shoulder in the middle of the night, I screamed. Not because I'm a chicken. And I screamed even louder when I saw the same nurse was standing over me with some metal tool. She was saying something, leaning towards me, but I wanted to escape. She pressed me against the wall and clutched the bedspread. I shrieked, calling for help. In the end, my roommate woke up and screamed in horror too. The doctors rushed to our ward and... Anyway, there was no mysticism, as you've already guessed. Just a nurse on duty doing her job. She worked at night. Her duty was to measure the kid's temperature and check if someone was ill. So she went around the wards at night, checking. I felt like a fool. Well, the truth is, I woke everyone up. I scared my roommate, and that's because of these stupid horror stories. On the other hand, was it really possible to somehow differ the creepy nurse from others? After all, they all are wearing the same caps, the same gowns, and the same masks. Well, who's the ghost and who's not? Let's play a guess game. In the morning, I told everyone we better stop inventing stories. Otherwise, we would start fighting with aliens and go crazy someday. Everyone agreed with me. So, we stopped telling scary stories in the evenings. At night, when the nurse came back to our ward, I just covered myself with a blanket and tried to fall asleep. It didn't work out well. Something was straining me much, as if I had missed something. The nurse took out a strange metal syringe from a metal trolley. She bent over my sleeping roommate and silently inserted the needle directly into her arm. The roommate didn't even twitch. She didn't move at all. I was about to ask the nurse what was going on, but when this woman turned around on her heels, I put my hands over my mouth not to scream. I could have sworn her eyes were shining, like a cat's. That was creepy. And then she made a strange gesture with her hand and just disappeared. This was definitely something paranormal. I couldn't fall asleep until the morning. For a long time, I tried to convince myself I just made this all up. It was just my imagination, a nightmare. In the morning, I realized what exactly alerted me when that nurse appeared that night. Yeah, every nurse wore masks, gowns, and caps, like all the hospital workers. But all the nurses wore slippers. None of them, especially the night shift nurses, wore heels. And my nurse definitely wore heels, as I heard their clicking on the floor. After her kids died, this time too, she came to my roommate wearing the heels. My roommate didn't wake up in the morning. During the morning rounds, the doctors were running around with some papers, and I just stood there and thought, who's next? I no longer had any doubts there was a ghost nurse in the hospital. Why? I didn't know about the diseases of other guys well, but that roommate had just had kidney stones. Well, something like me, it's not fatal. This does not cause people to die in the middle of the night with a diagnosis of heart failure. The legend coincided even in the small details, like the worst regimen violator was the first one to die. Then the ghost nurse removed those who violated the rules of the hospital. And that's when I really got scared. No, I wasn't some kind of violator, but I often wandered around after lights out. And the worst thing was, she saw it. I was sure I was the next one, and I needed to get out of the hospital no matter what it would take. Of course, I immediately called my parents. I told them the whole story. I cried into the phone that I couldn't spend any more nights in the ward after what had happened to my roommate. My parents got it, but it turned out things weren't so simple. The doctors refused to release me. Well, they said that yes, it was possible, but only after the morning round. Tomorrow. They offered to let me spend the night in another ward if I was so worried about the case with my roommate. They just called it the case, like it was an ordinary thing. The next night was going to be the scariest one in my life. I moved to the next ward, to the other guys. I poured out some salt on the table. Supposedly, it should scare away all ghosts. I prepared to protect my life no matter what it would take. But how can you protect yourself from something that lives in another reality? I was lying under the blanket, shaking with fear. Every sound from the corridor seemed to be terrible and fatal, but nothing happened. The doctors were just walking in there. The nurses looked in a couple of times. Every time my heart stopped, but they were all normal nurses. I almost believed everything was fine. I even dozed off for a while. And then there was a creak and a clatter, and then she appeared in the doorway. I no longer understood how I could have mistaken her for an ordinary woman before. She wasn't human. It was a monster. A cruel and terrible one who came with a sole purpose of killing me. It stepped over the strip of salt at the threshold as if there was nothing there, and it moved straight to my bed. I pressed myself against the metal back of my bed with such force that I probably had some bruises. I wanted to scream, but for some reason, no sound came out of my mouth. I mentally recited the prayer that my grandma taught me, but it didn't help. She continued to walk towards me, holding a metal syringe in one of her hands. And then I couldn't stand it. My nerves failed. I threw off the blanket, aiming it at the nurse, and ran in the corridor. I didn't know where I was going. At least, I wanted to go as far from her as possible. The irony was that the nurse saved me, but I mean the normal one. She caught me terrified and shaking in the boiler room. She didn't even scold me for walking in the night. She took me to the nurse room, gave me some tea, and allowed me to stay at her place. I was sure my life had been saved because of the adults. A nurse, a doctor, and another nurse. It doesn't come to adults. In the morning, my parents took me home as promised. I still had to come to the hospital for the procedures, but I was allowed to spend nights at home, in my own room, without any ghosts. And the first thing I did was go to Google the creepy nurse. And I didn't find anything. Yeah, people died in the hospital, but this was a hospital, right? People sometimes die there. Yeah, some strange things did happen in the kids department, but there wasn't a single mention of the creepy nurse on the internet. But it didn't matter anymore. I was at home, so I was safe. I thought so. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up because of the heels click on the floor and a long creak. It found me here too. I don't know what it is. I don't know if I'd survive this night. But just in case, I've written my story in my diary. Maybe it will help someone to escape the creepy nurse. Type in the comments your versions of what happened. Tell us about your paranormal experience. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to never miss a new story.